Okay, so Deadlock. This thing kind of came out of nowhere, didn't it? It's been causing quite the buzz online because not only is it a MOBA, but it's also a new Valve game that is currently available to play in an alpha stage. As a little history lesson on old TT here, I've been playing Dota for a very long time, since all the way back in 2012 when I got a beta key for Dota 2. And it's a game I love dearly. It's a very formative game for me, and it's something I come back to many times a year, much to my own detriment and despair. It has that addictive gameplay with the highest highs that you just can't get anywhere else. And when I learned that Valve was making a new MOBA in the form of Deadlock, I was worried. Valve and the way they handle their games has me worried about the development for Deadlock and its future. But before I go any deeper into the subject, it's finally time for me to complete my YouTuber initiation by welcoming the channel's very first sponsor. And if you love Norse mythology, you might want to listen closely. Have you ever wanted to wield the mighty powers of some of Norse myth's most powerful heroes like Thor or Loki, but don't really know how to? I know I've always wanted to be a hammer-wielding god of thunder, but there's one small problem. I'm no god, and I don't have lightning at my beck and call. Thankfully, today's video sponsor, Raid Shadow Legends, will be able to help with just that. And right now, they're running one of their biggest events to date, the Asgard Divide. During the Asgard Divide in Raid Shadow Legends, you'll get the chance to command the champions Thor, Freya, Odin, and Loki, and everyone can get the legendary champion Loki the Deceiver for free just by logging into Raid for 7 days between now and October 23rd, with even more rewards after that if you keep logging in. You can also acquire the other Norse-themed champions by performing other in-game activities as you play between now and November 22nd. Raid Shadow Legends is your go-to game for turn-based RPG action in the palm of your hand, where you are tasked with assembling a mighty army of champions that you can level up, upgrade, and equip with powerful gear so that you can take on the evil forces ruling over Teleria, or even other players in the game's own PvP arenas. If you're new to Raid Shadow Legends and want to give it a try, you can click the link in the description below to get access to $60 worth of items that will help you get a massive head start on your journey. So just hit my link, and once you're in and crushing your enemies, come find me under the name Testing Tries, join my clan called the Triangle Testers, and we'll be legends together. Thanks so much for Raid for sponsoring the video. I think that Deadlock, even in its alpha form, is an amazing game, and I want it to succeed. But the game's biggest problem is easily its own developer. So let me dig into everything about Deadlock and why Valve making the game might be the thing that ultimately spells its demise. And while I have you here, it would mean a lot if you would like and subscribe down below. It supports the channel and helps spread the conversation. Now let's dive in. So Deadlock, just by nature of existing, is very strange. This is, for one thing, a new IP released by Valve. This is very much worth talking about. Valve is not known for making new IPs like this out of the blue, as they take their sweet time making anything at all. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention how this game was even released to the public. As of right now, Deadlock is considered to be in a closed alpha, and the word closed being in 2 giant finger quotes here. This game was slowly rolled out to people all over the world, and as people got invited into the alpha playtest, they also got the ability to send their friends invites as well. So those friends get invited, and they get to send invites to their friends as well, with no limits. The game spreads like a virus, corrupting everyone's Steam account until it eventually hits complete and total saturation. To my knowledge, a game rollout like this has never really taken place like this before. Alpha and beta rollouts are nothing new, but the way Valve is using their platform is something very unique to how the storefront operates as a whole, which works really well considering how easy Deadlock is to pick up and play from the get-go compared to other MOBAs on the market. But the game, as it stands right now, is rough. Like, you can still play the game from start to finish, but a lot of things in the game still need several layers of spit shining before they'd even be considered close to done, but we'll dig deeper into that later. But in order to get a deeper understanding of what Deadlock is, I think it's important to understand how we got here. And I think the best way to start is to look at where Deadlock came from. So Deadlock's development is led by the one and only Ice Frog, who is quite the enigmatic figure. You might know him as the dude that invented the MOBA genre with his mod work on Warcraft 3 all the way back in 2003. If you know anything about Dota or League of Legends, you will understand Deadlock right away. But if you're not familiar, let me break it down for you. So Deadlock sees you and your team team of 6 characters with unique abilities go up against another team of 6 characters. You fight down 4 different lanes to secure enemy kills and destroy their towers to push the lane and your creeps closer to the enemy ancient. And when your team destroys the enemy ancient, you win the game. That's all you need to know. It works just like any other MOBA on the market. Now, where the depth comes from is how you and your team communicate to gank unsuspecting enemies, split push lanes to push them up and move enemies out of position, secure last hits on creeps to score gold, or souls in this case, and what items you buy to build your character in unique ways that benefit their kit and playstyle. If I were to look for the closest analog here in terms of games on the market, it would be Smite or Paragon. Both are 3D MOBAs that are focused more on the intimate team fights that require aiming and positioning over a 3-dimensional space. MOBAs are notoriously complex games because of the amount of variables on offer over the course of a 30-minute to an hour-long match, and it all starts at the character select. Little things that someone does in one lane at the 2-minute mark can have long-lasting effects later in the match and could potentially win you the match. Or they could just as easily lose you the match if you and your team aren't playing accordingly, because you have to worry about securing last hits, denying enemies their last hits, not dying, supporting your team in fights, buying the right items to counter an enemy character, jungling for excess souls to buy stronger items, ganking unsuspecting enemies, and yeah, you get the point. These games are overwhelming for new players, and it's one of the things keeping the MOBA market so stagnant. There aren't really any new players playing MOBAs anymore because the collective knowledge of the player base is already so complex and nuanced. There are unspoken rules that the game never tells you about, and if you play in a way someone doesn't like because you don't know about the 18 little rules they made up in their head about what makes someone a bad player, they just end up throwing the match and you don't get anything from the experience, just a loss on your profile.
He dies without killing one, I'm leaving. Waste my time in this garbage.
These are games that require dedication and intrinsic motivation to improve. If you want to play better, you need to practice. You need to dig deep into other people's gameplay, learn what they buy on what character, how they do lane matchups. I'll spare you the details. MOBAs are hard-ass games, man. And I believe that's why Valve decided to make Deadlock 1, a brand new game, and 2, a third-person shooter, as opposed to another isometric game like the most popular MOBAs on the market. I think someone at Valve, namely IceFrog, knew that MOBAs as they stand today are just too complex with too many things that new players need to know in order to play them well. New players are required to play efficiently with an antiquated perspective. They have to play well in a team constantly berating them for playing poorly because they're new, and they have to learn to lose badly. And none of those things are conducive to a good and meaningful gameplay experience. And that's why I think they decided to start fresh with a brand new game. A fresh start means a brand new level playing field for everyone involved. New characters, new mechanics, and most importantly, a new perspective, third person. Gone is the old top-down camera. Now you're over your character's shoulder and you have a gun. The basics are all here. The lanes, the creeps, the jungle, the items, everything that a game needs to be a MOBA is here, but the way the game uses them is unique and relies entirely on the game being third person. It takes everything you might know about playing League or Dota and flips them around in a way that creates a whole new gameplay experience. While you may recognize things from other games, Deadlock uses those things in new and interesting ways to level the playing field. Deadlock needed to be a third-person shooter. Now let me dig into why. While MOBAs like League and Dota are still immensely popular, I'm convinced that new players won't want to try games like League or Dota because of their antiquated play styles that just don't feel good. Have you ever tried to get a friend into one of these games? I know I have, and it's immensely difficult to do so. Both League and Dota have been around for 10 years, and they still play like a game from a forgotten era, having to constantly move a step static camera around a battlefield just isn't fun. And if you're not experienced with it, the learning curve is steep. That's why players today are more inclined to play games with a controller than with a mouse and keyboard. It's just the way gaming has been moving towards for some time now. Moving a camera to adjust a third-person view feels a lot less gamey, and it instantly grounds you into the battlefield, unlike an aerial perspective. And I mean, there's a reason the RTS genre hasn't been as prevalent in gaming over the last 10 years, and it's because they require mastery to learn macros and what every button on the keyboard does. It's like telling someone they have to spin a plate, then you keep adding more and more plates for timers, enemy positioning, map awareness, vision, buying items, etc. They're not intuitive games to play in the slightest because of their unique perspective, but the gameplay underneath is what keeps people coming back, and for good reason. The MOBA genre is incredibly addicting, and it always will be, because starting out as a level 1 goo baby and growing into a bringer of death and destruction by the end of the match by getting currency, killing enemy heroes, and taking structures to secure a win is this addictive gameplay loop that cannot be acquired anywhere else. It's the growth, the idea that you're making this snowball of a team bigger and bigger as you play. That's what gets people coming back. MOBAs give you the highest highs and the lowest lows, and you're always craving that next win. And games are just the right length to feel challenging, worthwhile, and it gives everyone the space they need to make game-changing plays. The comebacks in Dota are absolutely legendary and are a vital part of what makes MOBAs so appealing. Now take everything I told you and make it third person, and suddenly it's a whole new ball game. The developers at Valve wanted to make the experience of playing a MOBA much more compressed and casual friendly, but that's not the only reason. I think IceFrog and the developers over at Valve saw the few successes of third-person games like Fortnite and PUBG on the market and knew that there was a gap for making their own third-person MOBA that felt just as good to play as one of those games. They could also make a game that utilizes mechanics that people know from existing hero shooters so that the onboarding process would be much more enticing. People know how to play shooters. They understand reloading, 3D movesets, and abilities, and with that player knowledge already established, it makes it much easier to pick up and play for newer players. Basically, what Valve did was use the third-person shooter genre as a framing device to get as many people to play as possible. It also uses this framing device to make the gameplay much more casual, friendly, and fast-paced. It's such a smart development decision, honestly. Deadlock plays very similarly to Fortnite, and it's all for the better. It controls very simply, but also feels great to play despite being so early on in development. All you have is your basic shoot, ADS, your standard 4 abilities, and has some other things dictated by a stamina meter that you need in order to double jump, dodge, and air dodge. The game has a really good sense of momentum, and at the same time also has a great range of mobility on offer. Characters can boost jump, reach higher rooftops by clambering onto edges like a master assassin, and just overall use the map as their playground, which is just not something you can get with other third-person MOBAs. Oftentimes, the movement in third-person MOBAs is incredibly stiff and just doesn't flow like Deadlock does. And that's one thing that informs its decision to be third-person instead of first-person or isometric, for example. It gives the player more freedom of movement and awareness over the battlefield and makes it just fun to move around with the zip lines, the sliding, the momentum mechanic, and the movement tech in general. It takes some getting used to, but it leaves room for the player to experiment and improve, but is still generous enough to understand what the player wants to do. And since Deadlock is a third-person shooter, it means that every character gets a gun. Guns for each character are unique, so they all offer different strengths and weaknesses. Some are head scan and others are actual projectiles that require a bit of foresight while aiming. And every character also comes armed with a basic and charged melee attack for all-purpose use. The shooting in Deadlock, though, leaves a bit to be desired, which is honestly not something I thought I would say about a Valve game. Usually, Valve games are well known for their iconic arsenals of weapons, but what we have on display right now is pretty lackluster. Guns feel not so special, but maybe that's by design? Since every character starts with a gun in Deadlock, gameplay is much more focused on persistent pecking at the enemy to get them to either die or leave lane. And early game, they're going to feel pretty pathetic, which plays pretty standard to the MOBA genre, but using a gun that feels weak just doesn't feel good, you know what I mean? When you're in a fantasy setting like Dota and everything is mystical, there's an element of suspension of disbelief. I can believe that when I play someone like Venomancer, for instance, that his poison gets stronger when I level it up because he's just a weird mythical snake worm thing. But when it comes to guns, I think it comes down to how they are presented. If the guns visually evolved over time played in a match similar to how they do in Ratchet and Clank, it would give the players some better feedback on how strong their guns should look and feel in relation to the match length. Like say, I know I'm doing really well in the match if my gun has leveled up to a second visual style by 5 minutes, for instance. That could be my sign to go gank a lane or start pushing the enemy a bit harder in the lane that I'm currently in. It's similar in style to how people play when they first get their ults, but just with more visual feedback for the player. Because as they said now, the guns don't feel great to shoot because they're just pea shooters, and when you get into items, it's just like, they make you shoot the bullets harder? There are some items that recontextualize the gun shooting harder with different ammo types, but man, I don't know. It just doesn't make sense to me. And as a result, it makes the gunplay feel really weak. But just because Deadlock has shooting in it doesn't mean it's the most important part of your kit, because it's basically the MOBA auto attack of the game. Instead, you'll be using your gun in conjunction with your melee and abilities to deal your damage. If your gun is your bread and butter, your character's abilities are what make them really stand out from the pack. And as one would expect from the lead developer of Dota, the characters are all fairly well designed and have abilities that take full advantage of 3D space. My favorite character in the game, by far, is Abrams, who bears a striking similarity to Spirit Breaker in Dota.
Hell no, man.
Abrams is all about getting up in the enemy's grill with a charge, an AoE dot, some passive damage resistance, and an ult that sends him flying straight into the air to charge a powerful ground slam that damages all enemies within an AoE and knocks them up. Another character that really shakes up the MOBA genre is Vindicta, the resident sexy ghost girl whose whole gimmick is hovering over the battlefield with her full auto sniper, picking off low health enemies while she's scoped in with her ult. She's all about getting the high ground and maintaining it as the game's resident sniper. Now, as I've been describing these characters, you might be noticing some similarities between these characters and, say, Reinhardt and Widowmaker from Overwatch, for instance. Their kits are pretty similar in some respects. Abrams is all about charging in and dealing a bunch of up-close damage like Reinhardt would do, and Vindicta sure does operate a lot like Widowmaker, and these comparisons are well warranted, I think. Both games are very much about using your abilities, your default weapon, and your ultimates to turn the tide of battle into your favor. And the majority of abilities in both games have to do with spacing, whether it be for creating space for you or denying the enemy of theirs. The abilities a character has also defines their role and what they can bring to the team, and when combined, these characters can create some game-changing plays that can win you the match. Both of these games use abilities in similar ways, and some abilities are just lifted wholesale from Overwatch, like Haze's Death Blossom ult, for instance, which is just really funny, honestly. But Deadlock gives you so much more control over how you want to level your character and what abilities you want to focus on. If I'm playing a character like Warden, for instance, I always go with his lockdown skill first because it makes the early game much more dangerous for the enemy by allowing me to secure kills and keep the enemy out of lane, denying them souls and skill points. Every player is going to play a character their own way using the abilities on offer, and I think that's honestly really cool. This is a thing that's pretty common in MOBAs, so I'm glad to see it included here. But before I move on, there's one thing I want to clear up right now, and I might catch some heat for this, but here goes. Deadlock is not a hero shooter. While Deadlock does share a lot of similarities with hero shooters like Overwatch in the sense that you can pick a character with unique abilities and, well, shoot, I don't think it's the primary draw. In hero shooters, rounds are traditionally much shorter and only last a handful of minutes. You are also encouraged to swap to different characters to fill the empty spots of a limited team comp to keep up with changing needs and strategies. Whereas in Deadlock, it's structured more like a MOBA. Go figure, right? You pick a character, you stay that character, and you level up through the match by getting a currency that you can use to buy items and snowball multiple objectives to eventually win the match that could last upwards of 30 minutes. It's like, I get the comparisons between games like Overwatch and Deadlock, but the similarities are all purely surface level. Yes, Deadlock is a shooter, and you can play heroes, but you can't swap off of those characters and are instead forced to build these characters in ways unique to you and who you're fighting against, whether you need to play aggressive or defensive, and what your team might need. But that's not the only thing that sets it apart from hero shooters. Deadlock also does three really interesting things with the MOBA genre that deserve a closer inspection. These are things that are going to define Deadlock going forward. And one of them is the rail riding system, which is very similar to what you might have seen in a game like BioShock Infinite all the way back in, what, 2012? With each lane, there is a railway above the players' heads at all times that stretches from both your base and the enemy base. It's all one singular line. But what limits how far you can ride said line is how far your creeps are pushed up in a lane. If your creeps aren't pushed up very far, you can only ride to where they are stationed and it is safe for you to drop off. Same thing applies to the enemy. They can only push out as far as their lane is pushed out. So if their creeps are pushed up all the way to your team's base, they very well could just ride the rail all the way to your base and deal damage to barracks or do a bit of a rat play and end the game while the rest of the team is off fighting somewhere else. The second thing that sets Deadlock apart from other MOBAs is the souls feature. Usually when you score a kill in a MOBA, the person who scored the last hit on an enemy gets the gold, which is easy enough, and that feature is also present here in Deadlock. But this game does a unique thing where when anything dies, and yes, I mean anything, be it a tower, a creep, or an enemy player, extra souls will drift out of their body and float upward, allowing you to pop them like a bubble with a shot from your gun to score them. Or if left alone, they will pop on their own. So this means that when an enemy dies, there are actually two payouts: the souls you get from killing and the bonus souls that drift upward after death. You are also allowed to shoot orange souls that pop up from friendly units when they are killed by an enemy player, allowing you to deny your enemy the fruits of their labors and take them for yourself instead. So if you can shoot the orbs first, you get the rewards, not them. It goes both ways, so the sharpest shooters in the lane will always stay on top. It's a very skill-focused mechanic that also requires situational awareness of the battlefield in a way I don't think many other shooters really showcase. I really love this mechanic because it's this trade-off that you make in the thick of combat. While you focus on dealing damage to the enemy players, your lane partner can focus purely on killing enemy creeps, securing their soul orbs, and timing their reloads efficiently, as well as denying your team's creeps orbs as they appear. It allows for some absurd mind games and is frankly a lot to take in, but I think if your team can stay on top of it, they can deny the enemy some absurd payouts from kills they work really hard to get, and it's super satisfying to get those souls for yourself. The soul system also plays into how you level up this time around. With all of the souls you get from kills, they get added to the little flask next to your health bar that determines when you get a skill point. So instead of a traditional XP system, it works more like Dark Souls, where your money is your XP. But if you die, you don't lose that XP, just the souls as currency. And when you collect enough souls to fill your flask, you gain a skill point. The more you level up a certain ability, the more the cost rises, from 1 to 1 again, to 2, then 3, then 5. And lastly, there's the item system. So MOBAs and item systems are a very touchy subject for me, and where I suffer a lot of decision paralysis, and Deadlock is no different. But it does do something differently that makes creating builds for your character more intuitive and faster to keep up with the pace of the gameplay. The way items are divvied up this time around is this. There are 3 item categories: health, firepower, and spirit. Health items are green and deal with healing, resistances, and even denying enemies of their healing. Firepower is what you would expect. They're orange and affect how much damage you deal with your gun. They can also increase your ammo count so you can shoot more often and just generally be more of a nuisance. And then there's spirit, which is your magic power. These items are purple and have some wacky effects to alter your abilities, like giving you extra charges, extending how long they can last, and so on. But hold on, you can only have 4 items from each category at a time, forcing you to pick and choose what you need at that time. And most items in this game do not build into better items, so there's a severe trade-off you need to make from early game all the way to the late game. There is no right option, so pick what you like best. But similar to how you can acquire skill points by destroying towers, you can acquire 4 flex slots by destroying enemy walkers and barracks, allowing you to fill those slots with whatever items you want from any category. So if you want 8 orange firepower items, you're more than welcome to do that. The amount of build options in this game already is insane. So these 3 things are what makes the game stand out from the competition right now. But like, do they work? If I'm being honest, I was initially put off by what Deadlock did differently from other games I had played before. Since I come from a Dota background, it felt like the game was trying too hard to be Dota, but just in a shooter format. It felt like it was just throwing things at a wall and seeing what stuck. It didn't feel like there was any reason to have 4 lanes. The rail system felt tacked on as a sort of band-aid solution to having 4 lanes. The lack of a traditional leveling system felt unintuitive, and since there's no easily quantifiable 1 through 5 positions, it made it much more difficult to decide who gets farm priority for carries and such. But then I played another game, and another game, and another game after that. And the more I played, the more everything made sense. While the game does take a lot of systemic inspiration from Dota in terms of leveling and items and game flow, it wants to be a much more casual experience that lots of people can get into. It wants to be much faster and put less emphasis on single players carrying a game and making it a team effort. That's why the game has 4 lanes. It wants to put less emphasis on predetermined roles that determine who gets what and lets everyone on the team be a playmaker. There is still some wiggle room for people to slot themselves into tanky or support playstyles depending on the character they choose, but they have carte blanche to craft their character into whatever they think is needed in their lane at that time. And the rail system stretches from one end of the map to the other, allowing you to cover whole swaths of the map in just a few seconds. And how far you can travel on the rails is entirely dependent on how far your creeps are pushed up, allowing you to keep up momentum fairly easily if they're not dealt with by the other team. The rail system and how fast it operates also encourages frequent team fights from everyone on the team. So if you're all the way in the 4th lane and you see an engagement happening in the 2nd, you can hop onto your rail, hit the speed boost, and help your teammates in a tough engagement. This is a game that wants you fighting all the time, and there is rarely any downtime, and I love it. It wants you shooting at the enemy as much as possible and chipping them down so they either die or get out of lane to heal up. It's this brilliant little game of cat and mouse that's always on, and there always seems to be one lane that's left unattended, so it gets pushed up, and I know that could turn some people off, but for me, it condenses everything I love about Dota in a nicer, compact package with a completely different feel. The game is always progressing because towers are pretty weak and topple easily, and with every tower taken, they reward your team with skill points and even those flex slots that we talked about earlier when you take the tier 2 towers, allowing your team to snowball even more, like Heroes of the Storm for instance. It encourages you to play and perform well as a team. Sure, some players will have higher creep score, but every soul collected helps you and your team level higher and higher. Deadlock also makes it much easier to gauge how well your team is performing comparatively in terms of power just by a quick glance at your creep score on top. It shows what team has the most souls and who on that team might be the biggest threat, all from a cursory glance. I'm telling you, man, everything about Deadlock hits. It's this brilliantly designed package from top to bottom. Valve has had a bit of a rough streak recently with Artifact and Dota Underlords, but I am so glad they're up and running again with Deadlock. They really have something amazing on their hands, but it's going to take you time to learn why it hits the way it does, because it is both a MOBA and a shooter. Everything you know about either genre is flipped on its head. Since it's this amalgam of 2 genres, you'll be learning a brand new type of game. But if you have pre-existing knowledge of MOBAs and hero shooters like Overwatch or TF2, it will for sure kickstart your learning process. Or honestly, even if you don't have any experience with either genre, even though it's not very likely, I still think it's very easy to pick up. Many of my friends aren't huge MOBA heads, but even they are clinging to the game in ways I would never have expected. Someone I know who doesn't like MOBAs has been playing this game for 40 hours over the past week, and I couldn't have imagined anything like this happening. That's kind of an amazing thing when a game like this launches though. It means that everyone is on the same playing field and is learning aside one another. And it's casual enough for everyone to learn and have fun at the same time. The stakes are incredibly low at the moment, so no better time to learn than right now. And the more I play Deadlock, the more I come to appreciate what it does differently. A big thing that also makes it more casual friendly is how it splits teams into groups. The game defaults defaults to 2 groups of 2 and 2 solo lanes for each team, and it alternates between them. So if you're grouped up with 3 friends, it will always put you in groups of 2 rather than split anyone up. It also makes it so no lane isn't getting absurdly stronger than another because none of the lanes are considered off or safe lanes. It puts everyone on equal footing in terms of lanes and positioning, and it's genuinely really smart. I get a lot of performance anxiety when I play mid or carry, so this helps ease that pain a little bit. I'm in the same boat as anyone else in my lane, so it helps me to think that everyone else is going through similar bullshit. It's so much fun, and I cannot stop playing now that I'm past that little entry hump. There's so much brilliant design here that deserves to have a spotlight shown on it. Above everything, I think it's important to recognize that what's here could be enough. What's here in the current version of the game is basically a fully fledged product with enough gameplay variety to last for years and years. However, I have some problems with this game in its current form. Valve decided to release Deadlock in alpha, which is probably the most bold decision I have ever seen from a developer of this caliber. Even though the game is not available to play in a traditional sense and is still considered just a playtest, it's still very much out there to the world. I can understand the reasoning behind the decision. Getting it out there, accepting feedback, and working on it in real time is a huge benefit for a game like this that relies on its players working hand in hand with the developer. But it also comes with it a lot of downsides as a product launch. Instead of putting in the effort to release a polished product that they're confident in, it feels like they just kind of threw the game out into the wild to gauge interest. I understand that games take a long time to make, but Valve deserves to treat this game with the same amount of care and respect that all of their other products get, and I'm just not seeing that here. Maybe I'm being too harsh, I don't know, but I just get a bad vibe when I take a step back and look at the release as a whole. Clearly they have enough faith in the game to release it out into the wild like this, but it also gives off the vibe that they don't really think the public would care about it. I think if a game is good and is marketed correctly, people will come. And this whole release situation is just bizarre to me. But Valve is Valve. They can do whatever the hell they want. They can release a game in alpha, which means I get to criticize the game in the state that it's in. While I do think the game is brilliant in many respects, it's still incredibly rough in others. And no better place to start than with character balance, and oh my god, nothing says alpha build like balance here. It's clear that some character kits are just better than others for lane clearing, jungling, and burst damage, and with the parry mechanic, certain characters like Abrams get stunned and shut down almost immediately. It just doesn't feel fair to make part of his kit so dependent on melee damage that after one successful parry, he's basically mincemeat. And then there's Seven, which seems to be everyone's go-to character when they're starting out. His whole kit is just like absurdly busted, as he's good at just about everything under the sun. He's good at laning and jungling with his lightning ball and chain lightning, he has a stun, and he has the biggest fucking AoE in the game, with its only balancing factor being that it's line of sight based. It's no fun because he brings the whole game to a standstill. Everyone is waiting for him to stop jerking off in the air to shoot him because it just does so much damage and lasts for 7 seconds minimum. His attacks are really strong and he can shred team fights without putting in much effort. Thankfully, there are a lot of good items you can use to shut him down, but he's just annoying to fight against. Another thing I want to mention is the item pool. I mentioned how many items there are in the game, and it genuinely is a huge issue. There are too many fucking items in this game, and too few of them build into higher tier items later on. I generally don't think having a wide selection is bad, but when there are too many items, it gets to be too much of an ask for new players to decide what to buy. Like in Dota, for instance, when you start a match, you're given 600 gold, and what position you start in generally determines what items you should buy. But you don't have any souls to start here. You have to earn everything you get, and it also means picking from one of 22 starting items at time of writing. That's a lot for someone with a small brain like me, and really needs to be narrowed down at the very beginning. I think it was in a GDC talk where Sid Meier talked about making decisions with an inverted pyramid. You start off with a few options, and as you grow in power, more options become available for you to choose from. That's what makes Dota's item choices so good. There are only a handful of items that offer very basic benefits to choose from, and you get them to start. I wish Deadlock had a similar system because it feels so much much better than what's in the game now. And lastly, I'd say my biggest gripe with the game as it stands right now is the towers. Towers in MOBAs are these pacing tools the developer can use to determine how long they think games should be. They're like skill checks for each lane. They deal a good amount of damage, require a lot of poking and damage to take down, and are generally considered a persistent threat depending on what stage of the game you are in. Tier 1s are always going to be the weakest, but as you progress further and further in a lane, the towers should get stronger and more threatening to make sure that you and your team are up to par. But not so in Deadlock. Towers and the tier 2 towers, the walkers for example, are just abysmal. These things fall apart like a wet napkin when exposed to even the slightest bit of damage, and the damage they can dish out themselves is also really pathetic. The towers aren't really a threat to players because their aim acquisition is so low, so a player can easily take a tower down without worrying about sustaining any real damage at any point. And when you have dodges, you can just peace out from any angle and they're no longer a potential issue. It makes taking towers far too easy. It never feels like an achievement when you take a tower, just part of a to-do list because they all award a skill point to the team for each one destroyed. These need a significant redesign in order to actually feel like something worth worrying about. In other MOBAs, it's a huge deal taking a tower because each one of them means pushing one of your lanes a little further, and each lane is important in their own right. And when towers are so easily destroyed by players and creeps, it makes them much less valuable as a match milestone. This also plays into how power scaling works in the game overall. While comebacks are very much real in Deadlock, the snowball effect is in full force here. When towers are so easy to destroy, it feels like the team who can take them first usually stays in first, and the other team has little opportunity to recover, or at least that has just been my experience. Taking a walker to get the whole team a flex slot and a bunch of souls to buy new items feels like too much reward for so little effort, and when your lane is pushed up all the way, it makes getting around the map to capture jungle camps or delivering a soul urn way too easy. Both of these can be stolen if the player carrying them is killed, but there's little risk in that happening when all of your lanes are pushed out. I think the way skill points, flex slots, and souls are distributed needs a massive edit, because when one team stays ahead, it's difficult for the other to recover from that. I know the snowball is kind of a MOBA thing, but it just feels too punishing in this game. I also don't really want to discuss anything about presentation or sound in depth because, like I said, the game is in alpha. I trust that Valve will give the game an immense facelift in time, but a lot of the art in this game feels very slapdash. While I do think that the 1930s New York invaded by the occult aesthetic is really dope, and there has clearly been a lot of thought about the visual identity for the game, it doesn't feel incredibly cohesive when there are robots walking around. But I'm sure as the game gets developed even further, this will all get fleshed out and finalized, but who knows when that will be. Could be a few months, could be a few years. There are other issues I have with the game at this time, but they are minor enough to not really be brought up. The game is rough. It's an alpha. It still needs a lot of work. Why Valve decided to launch the game in this state is beyond me, but that also ties into the biggest issue I foresee with Deadlock. Like how Dota, TF2, and Counter-Strike are all major games with hundreds of thousands of daily players, I'm sure Deadlock will be no different once it reaches full release. It has already proven to be a success for Valve even in its early access form, and I think it's going to be even bigger in the future. But if I were to condense down all of my anxieties about Deadlock into a single entity, it would be Valve itself. Valve has a tendency to be very hands-off when it comes to their games, not just in communities, but also in development and dealing with cheaters. When you take a step back and look at how Valve has handled the community outroar from Team Fortress 2 being abandoned, I can't shake the feeling that this will be the case for other Valve games going forward. As of right now, even in early access, Deadlock already has a bit of a cheating problem with aimbotters just walking around in broad daylight. The game has no built-in anti-cheat system that comes standard in multiplayer shooters these days, and as the player base of early access players grows, so will the cheating. And currently, the only way to combat these bad actors is a manual review process, meaning that the player base has to police itself. And all I can see is the TF2 bot crisis happening all over again. A problem left unchecked will take over a game that is not even fully out yet, and that bothers me immensely. I think Deadlock is an amazing game, but without an automated process to remove bad actors from the game in early access, the problem will only balloon until it envelops the whole game. Now, I know that cheaters are nothing new in multiplayer shooters. They are basically synonymous with each other. For as long as there have been multiplayer shooters, there will always be that one dude who just wants to cheat. I understand that not every game is going to be perfect, but again, that's where the majority of my anxieties lie. Valve is too hands off with development and desperately needs to be more transparent with this game, as it's their first new IP in 10, 11 years if you want to count Dota, but even then, that was just a mod. If you really want to get into semantics, Valve's last new IP was Left 4 Dead all the way back in 2008. That was 16 years ago. So them actually taking the time to make a brand new IP from scratch, that's kind of a big deal for them as a studio, as they've been suffering from a handful of failures that just couldn't seem to take off. Artifact and Dota Underlords were both flops in their own unique ways, but to their credit, they did also release Half-Life Alyx, which is considered by many to be the best VR game out on the market right now. But then there's the caveat that barely anyone played it because, well, it's a VR game. So their track record with developing games over the past 10 years has been tenuous at best. And Valve is also known to take their sweet freaking time to make games and updates. They have a track record for not really sticking to the dates they set for releases, and it's the reason the term Valve time exists. I don't think cheaters are going to be the thing that kills Deadlock before its full release, but rather Valve's inaction and indifference. They know they don't need to finish any games because Steam prints infinite money. These developers don't have to work on Deadlock because Valve as a studio isn't really a studio in the traditional sense of how we know it. Valve is a place where people of varying professions interact and create with basically infinite freedom to do whatever they want. Scientists, artists, engineer, psychologists, economists, writers, and many other fields all gather at Valve to work on whatever they want. It's a playground for some of the world's most brilliant minds, which is what makes them a double-edged sword when it comes to game development. Their developers are cream of the crop and clearly know how to make a great MOBA. It comes with Ice Frog's legacy, but I'm also worried that their frankly antiquated development philosophy won't be what Deadlock needs to grow into something much, much better. And as far as I know, Valve rarely looks for outside assistance for gameplay updates and would rather handle all of those things in-house. And now they have to do that with 3 games right now: Dota, Counter-Strike, and Deadlock, since TF2 is dead. There's only so many people that work at Valve, and I think it might already be too much for them to handle, managing 3 services at once. It all feels like a house of cards that's going to collapse, all because they don't have the workforce to cover what their communities desire. I'm being a bit of a worrywart. I know it very well, but you can't say that my fears are unfounded. I know Valve, and so does every other gamer who plays PC games religiously. They can be a mysterious bunch, but I'm willing to remain positive about Deadlock and its future. Hell, the fact that Deadlock even came out in a playable state is a feat in and of itself, because most projects that Valve works up never make it out of early prototyping, and I think that Valve knows what they have on their hands this time. Clearly, Deadlock is something very, very special. It's been in development for a long time and has a lot of genuine thought and talent behind its design. Everything about it hits like a good MOBA should, and carrying on the MOBA legacy via a third-person shooter is going to be the thing that propels it into the mainstream, I think. Yes, it's clearly still very early on in development with a lot, and I mean a lot, of rough edges, but with time, they're going to fill this canvas of a game with something brilliant. Its design is absolutely magnetic, and my friends and I just can't get enough of it. Here's hoping Valve knows what they're doing with the game and treats the game and its community with the respect it deserves going forward. And you know what? I'm gonna say it. I think Deadlock is the best MOBA I've ever played. Despite the game's and Valve's shortcomings, I genuinely believe that the good massively outweighs the bad here. Not only is it more welcoming to new players, but it also manages to convert what I love about MOBAs, mixes it up, and compresses it into a much more manageable gameplay experience for people of all skill levels. Games don't last upwards of an hour like they can in Dota 2, and it's clear that was a focus from the beginning, to make the MOBA genre accessible to even more people. Yes, I have issues with it, but no other game has gotten the one more round itch out of me for such a long time. And it also scratches that team-based shooter itch that Overwatch lost for me a long time ago. It's this perfect little storm for the genre that cannot be understated. This game was desperately needed, and I'm glad we got it. So, with all that in mind, would I recommend you play Deadlock even in its current state? Yes, I would wholeheartedly recommend you play Deadlock. This is a game that only comes once in a lifetime and should be cherished for what it offers and what it means for the gaming market, even if Valve might screw it up later. So go play it, have some fun with friends, and hopefully it evolves into a game with a massive amount of polish that can go on and live a happy, healthy life with a thriving community. But that's just what I think. I would love to hear what you think about Deadlock in the comments section down below. Do you like it? What characters do you main? Do you think it has legs to stand up against other MOBAs like League and Dota? I also want to send out a massive thank you to my channel members listed here. These fine folks are the ones who have been helping this channel get places I never thought possible. And an extra special thanks goes to my $3 Triangle team members who are Cilantro and the Windigod. If you want to help support me in doing what I love, you can also become a member by clicking the join button below next to the like and subscribe buttons. Every little bit of support helps me continue making videos like these. And speaking of support, another thank you to Raid Shadow Legends for sponsoring the video. Be sure to check out the link below to get a head start in the game. More videos are in the works, so please stay tuned for more content like this in the future. This has been Testing Triangles. Thanks for watching.